All right, we're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar. Once again, thank you for joining us. We're very excited to get started on today's topic around using VOCA funds to house survivors of trafficking. We're going to go ahead and go to the next slide. I just want to point out some tools that you have available so that way you're able to connect with us and with the panelists that will be speaking today. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you have the chat box. If you go ahead and click on that, we want to make sure that it's working for everyone. And so if you'll just let us know where you're joining from today, what city and state you're joining, that way we're able to see that it's working, that would be great. If you click on all panelists and attendees, it'll show for everyone. So if you want to go ahead and test that out, that would be fantastic. Thank you. We're seeing some responses coming in from Iowa and Kentucky and Pennsylvania and Georgia. So this is fantastic. San Diego. So it's great to see people from all over joining us today. We also have closed captioning available. If you click on the CC closed captioning icon, that will pop up the closed captioning and you'll have that available. We will be recording today's webinar and we will be sending it out as a follow-up email in the next week or two. So just if you had a question around that, just know that the recording will be made available to everyone. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, definitely feel free to put those in the chat box. If you're comfortable sharing those with other attendees and panelists, definitely select the all panelists and attendees. If you prefer to share it anonymously, you're welcome to share it just with the panelist. Let's go ahead and go over to the next slide. Today's webinar is being brought to you by the Freedom Network Training Institute Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project. We are a project funded under the Office for Victims of Crime, and we primarily provide support to service providers around understanding different housing resources and models to support survivors of trafficking. We hold bi-monthly webinars and we upload those in our resource library that you can find on our website, freedomnetworkusa.org, and you can have access to all those recordings. So we're really excited for this month's webinar, and I'll go ahead and present our panelists in our next slide. Wonderful, thank you. So today we have the opportunity to hear from three really great panelists to give us an overview of what VOCA funds are, and also to give us the practical on-the-ground application of how those resources and those funds can be accessed through your state. Today we have Carrie Lufer, who is the Grants Manager Specialist at the Office for Victims of Crime within the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Justice Programs. She serves within the State Victims Resource Division, where she administers and supports OVC's Victims of Crime Act, or VOCA, formula and discretionary grants programs for a number of different states, including New Mexico. Whereas where the other two of our panelists are located, Frank Subia joined the New Mexico Crime Victims Reparation Commission in 2013 as the director, and he is responsible for administering the state compensation program and overseeing the federal and state funds that provide direct victim services statewide. Before joining the Reparations Commission, he also worked as a deputy superintendent at the J. Paul Taylor Center in Las Cruces for incarcerated youth. And finally, we get the pleasure of hearing from Lynn Sanchez, who is the Director of Human Trafficking Victim Services at the LIFELINK. That is in the state of New Mexico, in the Human Trafficking Hotline. She is also the co-chair for the New Mexico Human Trafficking Task Force and has over 12 years experience in providing outreach, intensive case management, and advocacy services to homeless women and families with severe mental health, substance use, and trauma histories. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Thank you. We are very excited to be able to share with participants and make sure that as you hear through today's presentation and at the end that you will have an understanding of what VOCA funds are. You will understand how organizations may have access to VOCA funding and also how to implement and utilize those funds in order to house survivors of trafficking. Next slide. Fantastic. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Carrie, and she will start us off in giving us the overview of VOCA funding.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Karen. And it is great to present and talk with all of you today. It's fun to see how many different states that you are chiming in from. So I look forward to this time. So today I'm going to talk with you about what VOCA funding looks like for housing at the federal level. So I'll start right in. The Victims of Crime Act of 1984, also referred to as VOCA, authorizes the Office for Victims of Crime to use monies from the Crime Victims Fund to support programs that assist crime victims. These include victims assistance and state compensation programs, which are grant funded by each state and territory, as well as discretionary programs funded directly by OVC. Next slide. Thank you. The formula level grant programs that support crime victims' compensation and assistance are awarded directly to state governments and represent the cornerstone of OVC's support for victims throughout the nation and are the largest share of Crime Victims Fund dollars used each year. Annually, each state sets priorities and allocates funds within that state. The VOCA Compensation Formula Grant Program offers funding to supplement state compensation programs that provide financial assistance and reimbursement to victims for crime-related out-of-pocket expenses. These may include medical expenses, mental health counseling, funeral and burial expenses, lost wages, loss of support, and has the potential for covering costs related to housing. The VOCA Assistance Formula Grant Program provides funding to states and eligible territories to support victims assistance programs with the provision of services to crime victims. Such services may include crisis counseling via a hotline, individual and group therapy, court accompaniment, shelter, safe housing, information referral, and emergency legal advocacy. Our discretionary programs and activities I think are pretty awesome as well, but I will save that for another time. Next slide, please. Organizations that directly serve victims of crime may apply for funding through their state administering agency, or SAA, which receives Crime Victim Fund dollars from OVC through these formula level grants. As noted, each state sets its own priorities, rules, and protocols for how it allocates funds within each state. Next slide. In 2016, OVC published the final rule to implement the Victims Assistance Program authorized by the Victims of Crime Act. This rule codified and updated existing VOCA Victims Assistance Program guidelines to reflect changes in OVC policy, changes in the needs of the crime victim services field, and changes in the VOCA itself. The Victim Assistance Rule represents a compilation of federal regulations that more clearly, specifically, and at times more broadly, interprets the VOCA statute that provides guidance on how VOCA victim assistance formula funds may be used. Next slide. The 2016 final rule expanded upon the guidelines set by the Victims of Crime Act as it relates to housing. The final rule states that, subject to any restrictions or limitations set by the SAA or the state, VOCA funds may be used for transitional housing for victims, including but not limited to travel, rental assistance, security deposits, utilities, and other costs incidental to the relocation for such housing, as well as voluntary support services such as childcare, counseling. Next slide. OVC views transitional housing as a necessary victim expense for some victims. We understand that this is particularly true for victims of human trafficking, as well as victims with disabilities who have been abused by caretakers, domestic violence victims and their dependents, and sexual assault victims. Under the rule, states will use VOCA funds for housing and shelter purposes to the extent that it is necessary as a consequence of the victimization and for the well-being of the victim. It's important to note the rule merely allows states to fund this activity. It does not require it. Next slide. Per the final rule, VOCA funds may be used to support victims of crime with housing negotiations and provide legal advice or intervention for housing to assist in addressing the consequences of a person's victimization. This represented a change from the original statute guidelines in that it now includes non-emergency legal services. It allows for legal assistance on a non-emergency and emergency basis where reasonable and where the need for such services arises as a direct result of the victimization. Broadly drafted, the rule includes legal assistance with victim-related family law matters and other non-tort legal services in a civil context, which would allow proceedings for housing. Next slide. Although the Victims of Crime Act guidelines originally prohibited relocation expenses, the 2016 final rule changed this. The rule states that generally, where necessary for the safety and well-being of a victim, relocation expenses may include, but are not limited to, reasonable moving expenses, security deposits on housing, rental expenses, and utility startup costs. What expenses are covered, how much, and for how long are all determined by the particular state. And it's important to note that while relocation expenses are allowable, mortgage expenses are not. Next slide. In August of this year, OVC's Training and Technical Assistance Center, called TTAC, released a field summary on how victim assistance funds have been used to provide support services to human trafficking victims. The report explores how state administrators have assessed the need for support services to human trafficking victims in their state, integrated that need through requests for proposals, and established funding terms and amounts. The report also provides additional insights on how states selected and monitored human trafficking subawardees. In the report, TTAC highlighted 2 states that provide housing-specific requests for proposals, Tennessee and California. In the Tennessee RFP, the state set parameters specific to anti-trafficking housing programs and allowed funds for human trafficking to be used for shelter, transitional housing, and hotels. In addition, in addition to these 2 states, the state of Utah allows a housing-specific grant program, or offers a housing-specific grant program for organizations serving victims of crime. The state currently funds 17 agencies, including, for example, the Asian Association of Utah, which specifically uses its housing program to help victims of human trafficking find emergency and long-term housing options. And very soon, we will hear from the state of New Mexico on how their programs support housing-related needs of human trafficking survivors. The OVC TTAC Field Summary Report is not yet available online. However, I have spoken with the folks with Freedom Network, and they will be sending you a copy via email shortly after this presentation. Next slide, please. Each state develops its own grant-making cycles depending on the needs of the state. This may be every year or up to 4 years. You may find each SAA's VOCA funding application instructions either on its website, or you may submit a request to that particular SAA. All state VOCA funding is competitive, and each state has its own system for reviewing applications. Each state also sets its own parameters and priorities for subawards, including as it relates to funding. As it relates to housing. Next slide. It is also worth noting that victims of crime may receive reimbursement for housing-related expenses by submitting a request for victims' compensation to the state administrating agency. Compensation programs pay for a wide variety of expenses and losses related to violent crime. Some states pay for moving and relocation expenses and rent for the first few months, and may require that the victim demonstrate dangers to health or safety as justification for a move. For example, the state of Indiana does not pay relocation expenses. However, the state of Iowa does. Typically, it can pay for, in the state of Iowa, they can pay for expenses such as hotel, moving costs, rental, deposition, and rent or utilities for up to 3 months or up to $3,000. Unfortunately, as I've recently learned, the state of Iowa has had to suspend its program, its compensation program, due to budget shortfalls. As a different state going across the US, the state of Utah, again, on the other hand, does cover a broad range of housing-related expenses, including current and delinquent rent and utilities, relocation and moving expenses, some legal expenses, and such indirect costs as a car repair if it supports the victim in remaining employed so that they can then keep and pay for housing. Victim compensation funds are often an underutilized resource that can offer significant financial relief for victims. Next slide. As I noted, a lot of these victims compensation and victims assistance parameters are dictated by the particular state. So it'll be really important to connect with the state in which you live to find out more information. To learn more about victims assistance, subaward grants, and victim compensation programs, it's best to inquire with each state's SAA and peruse their website. And I've attached a link here. And if you have difficulty finding the information that you need on victims assistance or victims compensation in your state, please feel free to reach out to your human trafficking grant manager, and I can personally work with them at OVC to get you the answers that you need. At this point, I am finished with my slides, and I will turn it over to Lynn and Frank.
All right, thank you. Lynn and Frank will go ahead and go to the next slide and turn it over to you all.
Okay, so I'm Lynn Sanchez with the LIFELINK, and this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I put this on here because one of the biggest struggles with working with survivors of trafficking is not having funding available readily for housing, for emergency housing, and having that housing be attainable, which means either low barrier or barrier free. And so what we found is, especially in the last 4 years, utilizing our VOCA funds, that we're able to, within a few days, get somebody from being in a very dangerous situation where they don't have any of these basic human needs to start building them all the way up to a sense of, the first two, physiological and safety, can be pretty much achieved in just, a matter of days if you have the right funding to make that happen. And so that's why I think this is such an important slide. It's really hard to work with a survivor if they don't have a safe place to be. It's hard for law enforcement to build a case if that victim doesn't have a place to be and they don't have safety. And so that's why I put this slide in here. Next slide. So barrier-free, low-barrier housing for human trafficking survivors is a best practice. We want to make sure that somebody has keys to their own door one way or another, so that they can feel safe and we can start building rapport and trust with them, and then work towards, building their future, a future of safety and well-being. One of the issues that we've had throughout the last probably 12 years really was people want to do the work, but aren't able to stabilize the victims or survivors. And just having, I was at a OVC grantee meeting in DC back when the world was different, before COVID. And one of our OVC grant managers told me, you should maybe check in with your the CVRC in your state, because there's this new, funding for housing. And so we did that, and luckily we had somebody within CVRC that we could talk to and have these conversations with and start building our programs. So next slide. This is our partnership between the LIFELINK and crime victims of New Mexico. Frank, did you want to say anything while I'm just kind of rambling on here? I think our response to human trafficking, especially since 2016, 2015, has been very collaborative with our state partner, CVRC. And I feel like we've made some really great inroads to really providing evidence-based treatment and best practices for working with survivors in ways that I can see are really being safe and effective, and we're not just counting numbers, we're actually changing outcomes for people.
Thank you, Lynn. This is Frank Zubia with New Mexico Crime Victims Reparation Commission, and we've actually established a good working relationship with the LIFELINK, and we tend to, we continue to enhance that relationship. One of the biggest challenges from, I haven't gotten to my PowerPoint yet, but one of the biggest challenges from the onset were us as a Crime Victims Reparation Commission agency, state agency, we had decided amongst ourselves that we had a plan with how we were going to potentially address the issue of human trafficking in our state. And once we actually had an opportunity to bring the stakeholders together and have a conversation, that whole plan just completely went out the door. And we continue to have those conversations with our stakeholders. And that's what's currently assisted us in what we call perpetual enhancements, not just to this particular victimization, which is human trafficking, but all of our victimizations in our state. So thank you for that, Lynn.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, this is now my slide. So I'm going to go into our presentation currently. Again, to kind of recap what Carrie and Lynn stated earlier, in New Mexico, the New Mexico Crime Victims Reparation Commission has two primary missions. That one is to provide compensation to victims of violent crime. And in addition is that we also administer both federal and state funding to organizations that provide victim services statewide. New Mexico, unfortunately, and I say that because we were kind of slow to the take. Although we changed in 2008, where it became a crime in New Mexico for human trafficking, we didn't change our legislative enumerated crimes for crime victim compensation until 2013. So anybody prior to 2013 was not eligible under compensation to receive services from our organization. So that was definitely challenging. We, though, at the time, when I spoke with my predecessors, we, as an agency, were creative with regards to ensuring that we were addressing those particular needs, and we were determining eligibility under either sexual assault, stalking, or assault to deem those individuals of human trafficking as victims. We changed that in 2013, and we continuously change how we actually operate with all of our crime victims in our state. In 2015, because of the efforts of the organizations just like LIFELINK and others in our state who assist victims of human trafficking, we actually received state appropriation. So they were at the legislature asking for additional funding to come to our agency so that we could augment our VOCA funding to ensure that this particular marginalized group could receive funding in our state. We got that in 2015. So thank you to all those organizations that were successful in, contacting the legislatures and making sure that we actually had state appropriation aside from VOCA. Our agency was able to administer this fund the first fiscal year, which was super challenging. Again, our state, we're a state agency, and we're not necessarily, we don't have the capacity to administer funding fairly quickly. We typically work on a reimbursement, and I'm going to get into how we've actually created segues in which to access our funding fairly quickly. But ultimately, when we had that state appropriation and also the VOCA funding, it takes us a while in order for us to provide funding to those organizations and ultimately to the clients, to the victims in our state. So what we ended up doing is soliciting both our VOCA funds and our state funds in 2016. But before we ended up soliciting that, we met with our stakeholders and we found out from them directly what the needs were in our state. And we were educated, because our ultimate plan when we first received our state funding was to then merge it in or incorporate it into our compensation program. Our compensation program has various statutes, rules, and regs that we have to abide by. So when we were discussing those, the plan, as I referred to earlier, the plan was for us to then just merge it so it would ultimately make it easier for any victim of crime to access these funds. But what we ended up doing was we ended up soliciting both our VOCA funds and our state funds to various service providers statewide. And we've been doing that since 2016, and we've been pretty creative on how we actually do that. Currently, we fund 6 agencies statewide in New Mexico, and they receive funding in the amount of $589,000, and that's both VOCA funds and also state funds. Those primarily are for direct victim services and also emergency shelter for victims of violent crime, and then also barrier-free transitional housing. And I know that Lynn will actually talk a little bit more how she's actually implemented that barrier-free housing for her human trafficking victims. We understood at CVRC the importance of this underserved population. So when we met with the stakeholders, we also created, or not just recently, but we've always had an implementation plan in our state. And the implementation plan drives our funding. And it's an implementation plan where we bring stakeholders together, and stakeholders from within the state, and they tell us what the priorities are or what they deem to be the priorities in our state. And during these meetings, human trafficking was one of the things that we were being told that this particular population was needing priority consideration for our funding. So subsequently in 2016, when our solicitation for our VOCA funds was disseminated, we made any agency that was providing services to human trafficking, both sex and labor, a priority in our state. One of the challenges, and I know that Lynn and I will actually kind of talk about this later on in our presentation, is that we understood that accessing services and accessing funding was challenging. So what we did in 2016 is that we partnered up with 13 nonprofit organizations statewide, and we did that regionally. So we were strategic on who we were reaching out to. And these were VOCA recipients who were in good standing with our agency. And what we did was we provided extensive training to these agencies. So then if and when we had not just human trafficking victims, but any victim who needed to access funding fairly quickly would have the accessibility. So then what these 13 organizations statewide were doing for us were expediting payments. So these organizations were able to provide hotel stays almost immediately. We were able to provide bus tickets, airline tickets, provide immediate, either for prescriptions or various needs throughout the state. One of the things that we also worked and working with Lynn at the LIFELINK was that particular group of victimization, human trafficking, we understood that they just had a slew of challenges with regards to accessing funding. So in addition to that, what we did with the LIFELINK was we established crisis stabilization funding for human trafficking victims in our state. And what that does is that with our VOCA funds, it enhances our VOCA funds, and whatever VOCA can't necessarily cover, our crisis stabilization funding can cover. And what we've also utilized within our organization is our VOCA emergency funds, our sexual assault funds, our domestic violence funds. So we recognized that when individuals or victims in our state need to access funding, it's an emergency situation for some. So we wanted to ensure that those victims were able to tap into or have access to those particular funds. I say that because we understood that sometimes navigating through all of the bureaucracy and navigating through some of the challenges with administering both the VOCA, our state funds, and our various other discretionary money is super challenging. So within CVRC, we actually designated 2 single points of contact within our own organization. And those individuals are primarily set up to access, and they work closely with all of our human trafficking providers in the state to navigate and ensure that they are accessing all potential resources, such as compensation, state crisis stabilization funds, again, the VOCA emergency funds, and sexual assault funds. We heard from all of our providers, for many of our providers that may not be familiar with the resource, that navigating and having these 2 individuals actually set up in our organization to kind of weed through the red tape, and that's just my technical term, was super beneficial to all of the victim service organizations in the state, and then also the organizations that not just that dealt primarily with human trafficking victims, but that also dealt with all victimizations in our state. So what we've done is that we've made all of this funding accessible to all of our victims of crime in our state. I say that because it's a partnership, and I have to give extreme kudos to all of our nonprofit organizations who have been able to provide this funding fairly rapidly, usually within minutes of when a request is actually requested from a particular agency. They're able to access that funding without all of the red tape that usually takes place. In our constant pursuit of perpetual enhancements, we've also made it easy in our state to access funding, both through our compensation and then also through our victims, our service providers throughout the state. We changed our legislation. So as of July 1st of 2019, we've changed our enabling statutes to include victims who choose not to disclose to law enforcement, that they can now disclose to a licensed medical provider, a licensed mental health provider, or a tribal health provider, and they can seek our compensation services. We found out with working through our service organizations that a lot of our domestic violence sexual assault victims, also human trafficking victims, were not accessing our services because we required that they cooperate both with law enforcement and prosecution in order for them to be eligible for our services. So we strive to be more victim-centered, and that's just one of the hurdles or challenges that we overcame, and that was July 1st of last year. One of the things that I kind of want to also mention is that our organization, we're a small group, even though we provide compensation to victims throughout the entire state of New Mexico. I have 11 compensation staff, and I have 6 grant administrators in our state, and they do an amazing job. And I just want to give my staff kudos. During this health pandemic, when our governor shut down our state the second part of March, we, CVRC, started facilitating weekly meetings with all of our stakeholders by victimization to ensure that they had access to our grant administrators, to our compensation staff, because ultimately what was happening is that everyone was pivoting how their services were being provided in our state, and we wanted to ensure that they had access to our administrators. And one of the good things is that we were doing budget revisions within days, and we were allowing some of our organizations with our VOCA funds to purchase PPE equipment, to also purchase technology, because a lot of the services were actually being conducted virtually. We allowed them to also purchase, with our state funds, phones, because a lot of the clients didn't have the technology in order to access services from these various nonprofits throughout the state. I say that because one of the biggest things that I was always told by all of our service providers is that we want you to be user-friendly, and we want to have access to all of the resources that your agency ultimately has. And I think that we strive to try to meet those particular needs, not just with our service providers, but then also with our clients, and our clients being the victims in our state. And our partnership with the LIFELINK and how we actually are able to both work together and to ensure that their clients and our victims have access to stable housing. Because that's one of the biggest issues that we always run into is the instability of housing in our state. And we wanted to ensure that we, through our VOCA funds, created barrier-free funding for transitional housing. So it's not just our human trafficking victims. We've actually implemented that statewide to ensure that all of our service organizations who receive our VOCA funding have barrier-free housing for their particular victimizations throughout our state. Thank you, Lynn. Next slide.
And these are some of our statewide partnerships. Next slide. Okay. Sorry, I'm trying to move my chat off the slide. So yeah, because human trafficking it's still a developing field. We don't have the programs and long-term history of working with human trafficking survivors, like, for example, with domestic violence and rape victims. I mean, those have been kind of developing fields for at least 30 to 50 years. Having services in place has kind of been, in our state at least, it's been kind of done on the fly because, as Frank said, it wasn't even an enumerated crime until just a few years ago. So we want services that are specific to human trafficking survivor needs. And traditionally people used to say, well, they can go to a domestic violence shelter or they can get services there, and they just don't fit. So it's a different population with different needs. And we need things like safe houses, a crisis response, usually within the first, 24 to 72 hours, sustenance, education. A lot of our survivors in New Mexico, at least, we're finding, have anywhere from a 7th to 9th grade education. And that's one of the ways we look at, preventing further victimization is addressing those needs. Medical care, substance abuse treatment, substance abuse, mental health. Those were some of the factors that we kind of overlooked initially on when working with human trafficking survivors. And so those are some challenges that having, for example, VOCA funds or emergency funds that we can quickly get somebody their Suboxone or methadone pending getting medical care or medical insurance for them has been really instrumental in helping stabilize survivors. Transportation, and that's not just within the state, but say somebody needs to get back to their family. We can do that. Establishing laws that protect and provide restitution. We're still working on that in our state. We're pretty low. Our grade, I think, just moved up to a C because we passed safe harbor legislation, but we need to do more in terms of long-term sentencing for traffickers, and that is going to speak to one of the questions I saw that somebody submitted regarding, when clients return for services, and do you continue them with VOCA funding and that kind of thing. So for the last 12 years, we've tried to secure funding for the survivors as best we can. I feel like we've got a really good system in place now, working with CBRC, the two agencies that have RFPs for like our emergency money. We're pretty, it's easy for us because we can just go ahead and get what we need for the survivor, and then we can bill them later. And so that's good. Sometimes it feels like we're working backwards, but in a crisis situation, that's just what it demands. And I think it's most important to take care of the survivors, worry about the bureaucracy later, which sometimes gets us in trouble. But we have the conversations, and sometimes they're difficult, but we keep having those conversations. And again, like I said, when I was told or advised to approach our CBRC, it was really helpful that we already had somebody within that organization that we could talk to, and we could sit at the table across from each other and just, express what we were seeing the needs were in our state, and to have that, to have them be receptive to it. We're very grateful for that. So I think we found the most critical support for human trafficking survivor needs through our crime victims. I really can't see how other organizations can effectively provide long-term care for survivors or emergency care for survivors if they don't have that kind of barrier-free access, not just to housing, but to the financial resources that survivors need. Do you have anything else you want to add to that, Frank?
No, thank you, Lynn. But to the I just kind of want to emphasize is that the conversation I think you and I talk once a week, sometimes more, just depending on what situation is actually occurring. But making sure that we're actually having the conversation, and ultimately we're not always successful with what you may particularly want for a particular client, but there's always a compromise. And we always try to find a nice resolution to ensure that we're actually meeting the victim's needs. So thank you for that, Lynn.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next slide. So sheltering survivors, access to emergency shelter. What we're doing is we do use motels occasionally. We try not to because we have shelters that are set up again using, some of it is VOCA funding for housing, and we can rent apartments and use those as scattered site individual safe houses so that survivors aren't triggering each other or putting each other in danger, which we've found that happens a lot. It's been really essential during the pandemic. and way safer because the risk of, exposure to COVID is diminished that way significantly. And also because we have these agreements set up with a lot of hotels around the state, or especially between Albuquerque and Santa Fe. Our cities are about an hour apart. We're able to, if I get a call, say from law enforcement or even somebody who's doing street outreach for a victim, I can quickly Uber that person directly to a hotel, and the hotel is going to put that room under LifeLink's name, and then we're going to be able to work with the survivor that way, and either within 24 hours get them into a scattered site shelter, or see what they want to do if they're trying to go home out of state or something like that. So that gives us time for them to stop and think, and for us to help them like kind of safety plan on what their next steps are going to be. We do have 11 safe house rooms between Albuquerque and Santa Fe that are funded both by CVRC and some of our DOJ money. We have a program that we put together through VOCA, through their funding, which is barrier free. And this is 30 transitional housing units statewide. So we can actually house somebody in any part of the state as long as we get a W-9 from the landlord and a lease. And then they're willing to work with us. So we're finding that's been, really fast. We've had people that we've housed within just 2 to 3 days because we have some pretty good landlords that work with us. I think that really helps, let's see, in terms of independence and self-sufficiency, to get somebody quickly into a home, because a lot of the mental health symptoms and some of the even substance use kind of diminish a little bit once somebody's safe inside their own house. At least that's what our experience is. So we can meet them where they are. One of the challenges to getting people into, the shelters around the state are that they have to be substance free. Some of them have to have IDs. A lot of shelters mandate that people have IDs before they allow them in. And so we've taken away all of those barriers. And we can, like I said, just almost instantly get somebody off the street and into a safe place. The transitional housing allows for time for survivors to build self-efficacy and connection to other long-term housing providers if that's needed, or to just stabilize enough so that they can find employment and start paying their own rent when they're ready. So I feel that I've seen low barrier housing, and a lot of the challenges to that is there's still a requirement for not having substance use, or for being able to get a job within 6 months, things like that. And so with our program, that we were able to write the policy on ourselves, knowing what we saw as challenges that our victims were, or our clients were telling us, prevented them from getting into housing. It's been very, very efficient, and we haven't not been able to house anybody. So, yeah. And then typically we have our clients give us a plan for independence that we can work with them on. And we try to set it for within a year, but if it needs to be longer, we can do that. We can go up to 2 years according to our housing policy. So next slide. So for our COVID response, we have utilized Uber cards. So all of our advocates have Uber cards, which allow them to transport a victim directly from, like I said, law enforcement or other providers to hotels, and then into a safe house the next day, if that's appropriate. That has been huge, because one of the biggest, scariest really challenges when COVID hit was we'd get a call from law enforcement or child protective services asking us to help a survivor who was on the street or who was at a substation or something, and they'd say, "Can you come get her?" And of course we didn't want to do that, because we didn't want to expose our team or the survivor to possible COVID. So having the Uber cards really was a game changer. And I don't think we'll ever go back to having case managers transporting victims around when they really don't need to. If we can Uber them, it's more efficient and way safer. We created agreements with hotels to allow access to victims without IDs. That was one of the biggest barriers, finding hotels that would take people who didn't have IDs, which is the majority of our population. Let's see, getting Visa cards to purchase food, cell phones, transportation, hygiene products. So if we were going to put somebody in a safe house, we could go before the client even arrived there and make sure that the room had the cell phone and, you know, food items and hygiene products and things like that. The phone was really instrumental because they could get online and participate in, say, a methadone clinic online and get a prescription online that way. They could also do their therapy and, you know, PSR groups and stuff like that through the phone. So that's been really good. And it also just keeps them connected. I think phones are a #1 item for safety. It keeps them connected to their caseworkers and to other supports that they might have. Oh, and then we do utilize some Visa cards for online application fees for apartments. That way we can get survivors into the transitional housing within days. So as an advocate can work with a survivor over the phone, find the apartment that they want that fits, you know, the pricing guidelines, and then go through the whole application fee or process with them within, you know, 20 to 30 minutes, sometimes less. So that's been really helpful too. And next slide. So applying online for state benefits, we can usually within probably 15 or 20 minutes, an advocate can work with a survivor, contact the state income support division, apply for food stamps, apply for Medicaid, and apply for general assistance, which is, you know, a precursor to getting a disability if somebody is, you know, suffering from, you know, chronic or severe PTSD or other mental health issues. And usually the food stamps and Medicaid are within 24 hours, which is really great. And then they'll get a card mailed to them. And the general assistance usually takes just 1 to 3 days. And that's, like I said, it's about $240 a month. So that helps them, you know, have money to buy things like their own hygiene products and things like that. We automated our safe house entry. We were constantly changing our locks on the safe house doors. And now we just have, and I don't know why we didn't think about it earlier, but through COVID finally dawned on us that we could do the automated entry codes. And so now if, you know, the house is compromised or somebody, they're not going to lose their key, it's easy to just change the code on that. And then we put the welcome packets inside the units. So even though human contact is severely limited now due to COVID, we're able to maintain immediate and constant contact with survivors. We can provide emotional support that way and take care of their case management needs. It doesn't really replace that human-to-human connection. And I'm really seeing that as, you know, being a big challenge now to building rapport with survivors, because they don't get to see you and kind of just feel you, you know, being near them. So, but other than that, I think we're doing really well. And yeah, I think some of these changes that we've made through COVID are going to be long-term changes, even after the world supposedly gets back to normal. Let's see, do you have anything to add to that, Frank? Because I know
No,
I've definitely called CVRC in a panic over crisis situations around COVID. You know, how do we get somebody off the street? How do we house them fast? How do we get the hotel to take them without a ID? So we did some work on our own, and CVRC had already, you know, paved a lot of pathways for this. So this has been huge.
Well, thank you, Lynn. We've actually strategized with a lot of our nonprofit organizations, And we've reached out to them, and a lot of them already had relationships with various hotels and motels in their respective areas. So what we did was we just we asked them if we could potentially utilize the same either hotel or motel, and then we also established a relationship. So we're able to access these emergency shelters fairly quickly throughout the state. And again, it's just conversations that we're having with our service providers to ensure that not just victims of human trafficking, but all victims have access to potential emergency shelter, aside from our domestic violence shelters that we have in our state. Thank you.
Okay, next slide. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lynn and Frank. That was fantastic. We want to go ahead and take some questions, and there have been questions coming in through the chat box. So I just want to make sure that we also acknowledge those out loud, because there were some answers that were given. So I'm just going to go through the ones that were responses have already been shared in the chat box. And also we'll go ahead and ask the questions for our presenters who for questions that have not yet been answered. So one of the first questions that came in were if an organization that has applied for OVC funding can receive VOCA funding. And so yes, they can. Kristen Weschler, who's a OVC human trafficking program manager, mentioned that those funds are available through the state administrator. So you do not, as an organization, you do not apply to OVC for VOCA funds, but you would go through your state administrator. So that's one of the areas we wanted to point out. The other piece, or another question that came in was when Carrie was sharing about victims' compensation was there to assist victims in other ways outside of the direct effects. And so they give an example of, for example, car repairs. So the victim or survivor can get to work, and having the understanding that compensation was there for victims who have experienced a loss as a direct result of the crime. And so the answer to that was yes, it is possible. And so the determination would be made by each state on a case-by-case basis and using federal regulations and the state rules. So for the example that Carrie gave was if a victim needed to relocate for safety or well-being and needed a car repair to do so, then that could be covered. Also, if a car repair would mean that the victim could get back to their job and help pay for their transitional housing, that too may be covered. And also, Carrie, feel free to chime in on these. I know you answered them on the chat box, but I just wanted to make sure if you have anything else to add, feel free. The other question that came in was around VOCA funds being limited to violent crimes. And so what Carrie had shared was that victim compensation can pay for the expenses and losses related to violent crimes, and victims assistance can support victims more generally through the local VOCA funded victim assistance provider. I think those are the ones that came in regarding the funding. And then I just wanted to follow up with a question for Lynn around what you were mentioning around using the Uber cards. What those look like for, are they gift cards for each client? Are those usually, are they usually centrally or used centrally by the program for all clients? And can you explain a little bit more about the Visa cards? For example, are you getting receipts back from the client for all purchases, or how does that work on your end as far as providing those options for survivors?
Okay, sure. So the Uber cards are actually, they're just to load the app. So the advocates have the Uber app on their phone, and then we have an account. And so when we buy the Uber cards, the different advocates will load those cards onto their phone app, and then and myself included. So if I get a call, say from law enforcement, I can Uber somebody from their station over to a hotel, and it's going to show me on the app where that victim is in transit. It's going to show me when they arrived there safely, and then I'm going to get the receipt. And so it's easy to track that way too. It's easy to keep track of the receipts. I mean, honestly, receipts can be the biggest challenge. We have during COVID, Ubered somebody to say Target, so because they didn't have anything to wear except what they were wearing. So Ubered them to Target. I was already there. I waited outside. They did their shopping. And then I came in with the Visa card and paid for it, and I kept the receipt. It's really, it never works out when we just give the cards or, you know, checks or whatever directly to clients, because, you know, they're just, you know, they're in survival mode. They're not worried about keeping your receipts so you can give it back to your, you know, your grant funders and all of that. So it gets really problematic. And so far that's how we work with, you know, the debit cards is just, you know, we still have to be there at some point to get the receipt. We haven't figured out how to get around that challenge still.
So can I interject briefly? This is Frank Zubia. I want to go back to one of the questions with regards to compensation, because I know that most of our counterparts nationwide don't necessarily cover property, but I know that in our state, that if you have a conversation, we call our claims individuals who actually process compensation claims. If you have and I always train our compensation or state investigators to have a conversation with the victim. And I say that because we end up usually doing a cost shift. So whatever is eligible, like maybe we can pay for rent for a month or utilities for a month, just to try to stabilize those victims. And that frees up funds for them to do what needs to be done with regards to property. I always encourage all of our service providers, especially in our state, is that if they're not having a conversation with their state investigator, that's their comp claims individuals, that they're truly doing themselves and also their clients a disservice, because we get pretty resourceful when it comes to trying to meet particular victims' needs. And doing this for 25 years, and as a social worker, I live in a world of gray, and that world of gray has actually benefited a lot of my clients when I was a service provider for about 20 years. So please, 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 I encourage you all to have conversations with your comp programs and to ensure that you're accessing and utilizing all of the VOCA funds and state funds that are accessible to all of your crime victims. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.
Frank,
That's
this
really.
is Carrie.
Go ahead, Carrie.
Oh, I wanted to reiterate what Frank said, and on a national scale as well. You know, something that I brought up in my presentation is every state does this differently, but what I know is that there's humans on the other end of the phone in every single state and territory. And so that's what's really important, as Frank said, to have the conversation, because each crime, each individual is unique and different. And as Frank said, there may not just be one funding source, but multiple to try to support the individual in need.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And Carrie, there was a question that came in, and I believe you answered it on the chat box, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to also answer it verbally. So there was a question around the sort of benefits or access to these funds that undocumented survivors may have. So can you cover that?
Yeah, certainly. And I touched on it in the chat. I think someone asked that question beforehand, so I consulted my Lifeline, a colleague, and here's what I learned. So victims assistance, the rule is explicit that eligibility is not reliant on immigration status. And in the chat, I listed the part of the federal regulation that states that. So it's immigration status does not determine whether or not someone would receive benefits or support services through victims assistance. At the victims compensation level, in my understanding, it is not addressed. So it's not listed as an eligibility requirement, and the important thing there, victims compensation, those are the direct dollars to pay for out-of-pocket expenses. That would likely be determined per state, and there's been some cases back and forth over the years of how states have interpreted that. But again, I support or suggest that you guys go state by state to learn how they respond to that.
Wonderful, thank you. And so I want to go ahead and also get to some of the questions that were submitted through our registration link. And I want to go ahead and start out with a question for Carrie. So we had a couple of questions about when these funds become available or how that solicitation happens, and when would those grants be open for application.
Yep, so the best thing to do is to go to the web link that I gave you to find the state administering agency, because each state is going to do that differently, whether they have a 1-year grant or a 2-, 3-, or 4-year grant, what the requirements are, how the application process works. So you'd want to go to the state to find out what that looks like.
Great, thank you. There was another question that came in, and Carrie, but also definitely the other panelists, feel free to chime in, is around combining DV funding with VOCA funding when housing trafficking survivors. So are there any restrictions around combining the types of funding when providing services specifically around housing?
So,
you know, oh, go ahead, Frank, please.
No, please go ahead, and then I'll go after you.
You know, I was going to have a general response to say it's the same in regard to when other times that you're utilizing multiple funding sources to pay for programs. So whatever policies you typically have in place to track one set of dollars and another, you'd utilize for this situation. But Frank, what's it look like on the ground for you?
So we actually leverage all of our funding just depending on what the victim's needs are. So we sometimes, we utilize compensation funding. So we utilize our $3,000 cap on that. We also utilize our VOCA emergency funding. And then in addition, we also utilize crisis stabilization funding. So again, it goes back to that conversation, just depending on what the victim's needs are and how long could we potentially try to stabilize that victim to ensure success. Because most of our funding is actually, we have thresholds or limits. But when you start utilizing them and leveraging them collectively, you can go up to 6 months sometimes, as opposed to just maybe 1 or 2 months. So I would encourage you to, or not you as a service provider, but then also the administering agencies, is to have those conversations, because we have them daily. With a lot of our service organizations and stuff, in order to try to stabilize not just our DV victims, but all of our victimizations that are ultimately eligible for rent and relocation in our state. So we leverage all of our funding.
Thank you so much. And then one thing that we wanted to also highlight is about federal funds is that they cannot be used as match. And so as you're thinking about funding, just keeping that in mind. The next question I wanted to put out there, and we got a couple of these questions both on the registration link, but also in our chat box, was around using the funds for incarcerated women, and I am sure that could also apply to men and to individuals. So are incarcerated individuals eligible to access and receive funding through VOCA, and how, especially when they're coming right out of prison? So what does eligibility look like on that end? Frank and Carrie, if you all want to take that one.
Great,
Carrie,
this is Carrie again. Sure. So I'll separate between victims assistance, victims compensation. Again, I called my lifeline friend and colleague. The VOCA rule, the final rule is silent on this at a federal level as far as victims assistance for incarcerated offenders. But definitely I would suggest checking with each state. Many states we have known of have been permitting victims assistance support to individuals who were incarcerated. And I think the question is, after an individual, an offender, is released and out in the community, if I have that correct. From victims compensation side, we're not aware of any states that prevent individuals who were once incarcerated from receiving victims compensation. Most states have a rule that if victimization may have occurred while incarcerated, there might be certain separate rules related to that. But again, state by state, it's important to find out what that looks like. And Frank, what's your perspective?
So thank you, Carrie. That you're accurate. So in our state, in New Mexico, if you are incarcerated and you're a victim of crime, you're ineligible for victim compensation. But you are, once you're released, you're ultimately eligible for victims assistance. So you could potentially receive assistance through the agencies who receive our funding statewide. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, thank you. And I think what we've been hearing throughout the presentation is definitely there's the federal guidance, and a lot of the rules and how that's applied is going to come through your state. So we really want to encourage people to connect with their state administrating office. The next question that I want to ask is we'll start off with Lynn. And the person who submitted it asked if these funds should be only a one-time use. Their organization tends to have clients in a program, and then once they're done, they can re-enroll. But how are VOCA funding and VOCA funds that you all have worked with, do you all usually just do a one-time provision of services through those funds, or can they be accessed multiple times?
So Frank can speak on the VOCA piece of it, but for our VOCA grant, that allows us to provide housing. We've had survivors, 5 or 6 years ago, go through and complete the program, and then say their trafficker is out all of a sudden, and they're, decompensated, and they're right back to, the first, ground zero again. So we're able to bring them back into housing and our services at the LIFELINK. And definitely that's just part of the long-term care that a lot of survivors need. So for us, it's not a problem. And I think that is typically what happens. They come in and out a few times before they're finally, stable enough and engaged in their own future enough so that they don't need our help anymore.
So thank you, Lynn. I want to make sure that I articulate this correctly. So we sometimes have victims who have multiple victimizations. So we address each victimization independently. With victim compensation, our threshold or our limit is the $20,000. So once we actually reach that particular limit with regards to our funding is when we ultimately close out the case. We've had instances where we've had victims who were either sometimes re-triggered for whatever the reason with regards to any of their victimization at a later date when they're older, and we reinstate the compensation claim, meaning that we reopen it, and until we actually hit that $20,000 mark, then we ultimately close out the case. But we've had situations where, because our state, unfortunately, we're a poor state, and what I mean by that is that we don't have a lot of funds. So we do impose internally within our compensation funds internal thresholds or limits. So with our rent and relocation, it's $3,000. We also impose limitations with regards to counseling and various other resources. But again, sometimes when we have conversations with our service providers, they're in our statute, it allows us to consider safety and health. So there's not necessarily a workaround, but there's ways in which to potentially provide ongoing services to those victims, just depending on the needs. So again, I would encourage all of you to have conversations with your comp and both compensation organization, and then also your assistants, administrators in your respective states.
Thank you, Frank. And I'm actually going to follow up with another question that had come in, and this kind of goes right along with what you were just sharing. A question came in around what's the amount that can be used. So is there like a cap? Is that determined by the state? And how does that work? So that is both for Frank and then also Carrie, if there's something on the federal end.
So thank you. So yes, there are caps, but again, I think I said it a little earlier and stuff. So if you were a victim of crime in the state of New Mexico and you're eligible for rented relocation, we would utilize your comp, but in addition, we would also utilize, if needed, VOCA emergency. So that's an additional $2,000 that we could potentially access. And then depending on your crime, we could potentially access our sexual assault funds, which are discretionary funds, and they don't necessarily have a limit. And then also domestic violence, just depending on where you are in the state, we could potentially access additional domestic violence, either transitional housing funds or through our administering agency for VIPSA that, you know, we would then partner up with them. Again, it's just a conversation. Unfortunately, our funding is limited, meaning that it's usually for crisis stabilization. So we just try to go in and try to stabilize most of our victims, and then we help them or try to access additional long-term funding. I hope that answered the question. I know, Carrie, you wanted to add some stuff.
I really appreciate your answer, and you gave that really concrete idea of timing and the monetary amounts. And I mentioned when I was presenting earlier a specific state example, and they would pay up to 3 months or up to $3,000. And it's just a reminder to me how each state is different. You know, these are the entire program is at a formula level. So we're really trying to leave that the decision making to the states themselves. And they are each time, just like New Mexico, pooling their resources. Let me get the federal dollars and state dollars and a number of different resources that they have to support victim survivors. So unfortunately, there's not a one shoe fits all. But I guess for the benefit of each victim within each state, there are different requirements related to that.
Thank you. The next question I wanted to ask is around using the funding for housing. So we actually got a couple of questions in the registration, and I just saw one in the chat box as well. So the questions are around when programs want to use this funding, VOCA funds, for housing to be more than kind of the emergency response. So for example, rapid rehousing, which would be more of a rental assistance, or programs that want to do more affordable housing, and where the client might still pay some rent, but the VOCA funds might cover some of it. Is that allowable? Is that dependent on each state, or how would that work?
Mm-hmm.
Carrie, you want to go first?
Again, I'm sorry to give you the same answer each time, but again, it is state by state, not just about how long will they cover rent, how much will they cover in rent per month, but also is their coverage for, say, victims' compensation, is it limited to moving expenses, just emergency housing? Is it also transitional? Is it also into stable long-term rent? And then how long would that rent be covered? So each of those determinations are made per state.
So thank you, Carrie. In our state, in New Mexico, we allow the organization to implement their own thresholds. So some organizations, I know for a fact that most, I'm going to say more than 80% of the agencies whom we fund with VOCA for transitional housing, their limit is 2 years. And usually every quarter, that particular client is assessed because there's always a waiting list for those individuals. But we allow that the agencies whom apply for our funding to actually set their own thresholds. We don't set a particular threshold, or we don't impose anything like that. They do it internally.
Great, thank you. The next question, I'll start off with Lynn, but definitely Frank and Carrie, feel free to chime in, is around how the VOCA funding may support minors, specifically minor victims of trafficking. And so that could be, including them and their family or the individual. So are there any restrictions as far as the age of the person? And if not, how are minors able to access those services and that funding?
So what we've been doing is, for example, if we have a 13 or 15-year-old, say, sex trafficking victim, but they're living with a grandparent, or they're living with one parent or a responsible adult that's their legal guardian, we can provide services, housing help for them through that adult. And then we can connect them, because we don't do the treatment services for minors. And so we connect them to other agencies that do. And I have one that 3 years ago came into housing this way. And then now she's turning 18 and she's asking for resources directly for herself. And so we're going to, start her over again, because this time it's going to be, because it was her and her younger sister. So we're able to, we have the flexibility within our housing program, our transitional housing program, where we can kind of make those adjustments as we need, because, as everybody knows, every case is so different. And there have been others who came in maybe at 17, and they're pending getting emancipated, but usually that's such a long process that if we can find another responsible adult to help them sign a lease and stay with them for a period of time, then we can get them housed that way. Our state is still lacking severely in minor trafficking programs and support. So we've just been kind of piecing together everything we can to support them. But typically that's what we do. And I forgot the other part of the question. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. I was the other part was if there were any age limitations or restrictions with the funding. And so maybe for your program there are, but I also wanted to clarify more broadly for programs that are wanting to access VOCA funding, if there are requirements as far as how old the survivor or victim is.
Yeah, we haven't had any obstacles with that. So if we have, say, the 13 or 15-year-old needs to access, get funding for clothing for school, computer, a computer to do their work at home, things like that, we haven't had any trouble getting those approved through VOCA funding. So there's really no restrictions that way in terms of age or them being a minor.
Thank you. The last question, just because we are running short on time, was around any areas where they would be restricted, as far as what sort of restrictions may be in place within VOCA funding. So are there things that cannot be paid for? And because we are talking specifically around housing, Carrie, I'm not sure if there's anything that you would highlight there, or Frank, anything that you all have ran into.
I mentioned mortgage payments would not be covered, could not be covered. I saw that with some states, I think it was researching Utah, and they'll pay for, say, back rent. So they're overdue on their rent payments or their utilities. They'd pay for the dollar amount, but if there were fines and fees attached, so they got charged, 10% of it or something, they would not pay that overage. So that was something, but again, those were state decisions that they were making. It wasn't related to federal statute.
So we, again, what Carrie I just kind of want to reiterate, the only limitation we have is we don't pay for mortgages. I think the other restrictions that we have is that with both our VOCA funding and our state funding, just because we usually leverage both, just depending on the client, the only thing that we ultimately say no to, and I know that Lynn and I have had multiple conversations about this, is cigarettes and alcohol. Everything else is, and then mortgages, but everything else is pretty much on the table, and we can try to find a way in which to try to support that. I don't know if that answered the question or not, or if that just kind of muddied the water even more.
No, that was great. Thank you. And it looks like I think we do have time for one more question that came in through the chat. And it was asking about when there might be a program where they're going to, the client is going to exit and going to hopefully have more permanent housing. Can they still access that VOCA funding or VOCA programs, even if it's a couple years or sometime after their victimization has ended or they've exited the trafficking situation? Or is there some sort of time frame that they need to fall within in order to be eligible? And I'll just open that out for whoever wants to address it.
Frank, I'll let you go first this time.
Thank you. No, until we actually reach that particular threshold of the 20,000 under compensation. But I know that when we've worked with Lynn at the LIFELINK, and she's had victims resurface, and I don't mean any offense by that, but when they just come back and start accessing and utilizing the LIFELINK again, there's no limits to our crisis stabilization money, which is our state funding. Mm-hmm. And then if we haven't utilized the entire $20,000 under their comp, then we ultimately access that as well. So it just depends on the situation and the client. I know that to date, we have yet to reach a threshold under our compensation funding for a human trafficking victim. And we've been doing this now going on 6 years. I'm knocking on wood right now because it hasn't happened yet. And with regards to our crisis stabilization funding, which is our state funding, again, there's no limits to that. We've had victims of human trafficking and other victimizations who have resurfaced, and we are able to still access funding for them and their needs.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Carrie, were you going to add it to that?
Yeah, I don't feel like I have anything more to add than I haven't said already, as far as states making that those determinations.
Perfect. Well, thank you all. We really appreciate the questions that came in through the chat during the registration. So that has been really helpful. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next slide. We will be reaching out in the next couple of weeks with a follow-up email with this recording. I did see that somebody, or that Vandika, excuse me, just posted in the chat, if people want to have a certificate of completion for this webinar, please go ahead and email us at training@freedomnetworkusa.org. We will be sending this out along with the resources that were described here in the webinar with that follow-up email. We would love to get your feedback, so there will be a survey that will pop up. It's helpful for us to know that if the information is helpful, and also how we can improve our webinars to make sure that they meet the needs and what would be useful to you. We want to again thank the presenters, and we appreciate you all joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.